You're listening to the sounds of Deep Creek in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, along with a vocal crow who was there that day with me. It's great to have you joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you in March of 2025 from Atlanta in the Muskogee Creek Territory and former range of the Red Wolf in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Today, we're going to be talking about saving the National Park Service from Trump and Elon Musk's attacks on our federal government agencies with haphazard mass firings of our public servants who protect our national parks. Our parks were already overloaded with tourists who love the parks, including me, while the Park Service is chronically understaffed and underfunded already. To help us understand what's going on and how it's really affecting park employees and morale on the ground and the potential long-term harmful impacts on wild animals and habitats, and to find out what we as citizens can do to help support them, I turn to a retired Park Service Supervisory Forester Kristine Johnson from Great Smoky Mountains National Park to invite her on the show. Now, I became friends with Kristine last year when I drove up to Gatlinburg and interviewed her for my book on wildlife coexistence, and she introduced me to other dedicated Park Service employees and local wild animal advocates in Tennessee and North Carolina. Let me just tell you about Kristine. Kristine Johnson retired in 2021 from 30 years with the National Park Service at Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee and North Carolina, where she served as supervisory forester, leading the management of exotic plants to prevent diseases and save trees like hemlocks, and to preserve forest health and reintroduce native plants to overgrazed pastures, restoring native meadows and wetlands, home to so many wild animals from unique salamanders to owls, falcons, elk, bees, trout, and the largest population of black bears. A lifelong public servant for 40 years, Kristine started her forestry career at the U.S. Forest Service and then worked at national parks such as Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park, and my personal favorite, the Blue Ridge Parkway. Kristine still lives and hikes outside of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and volunteers in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Since she has so many ties to the Park Service community, I contacted her to find out more about the crisis and what we Americans can do to help save the jobs of our public servants. Welcome, Kristine.
Thank you.
Now, first off, what's the mood like in the Gatlinburg community? Because the whole community revolves around the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Since Trump orders froze park funding and hiring, and Elon Musk's Doge, that Department of Alleged Government Efficiency, fired a host of park employees on Valentine's Day with more mass firings planned for the month. Like, what are people feeling and saying, or what's the mood like?
The people I've talked with are confused and worried and surprised at animosity toward federal employees. The park it hires a lot of people that work locally, and so most people know someone that works for the park or someone in their families. Park employees and their families have been an important part of the local community for decades. And
Yes.
much of the economy here is directly related to tourism. So some of my friends belong to families who lived in the park prior to the park's establishment. And they know how hard the park employees work to protect the old home sites and cemeteries. And they're proud that their land where their folks live now belongs to the entire country. And they're afraid now that it won't be cared for. So in a small community, people see the impacts on their friends and neighbors. And we actually had a march here on Saturday
Oh,
from the downtown Gatlinburg through downtown Gatlinburg to the park boundary. There was about 40 people, and they got lots of thumbs up. They got a little bit of harassment, but it shows the support that people are offering up, not just because they're worried about the economy, but they're concerned about the park itself and the people that work there. And we feel like it makes us stressed and less able to reach out and help other people, like
yeah.
our immigrant community, that's also a big part of the tourism community.
Right. So much, yeah, stress and concern. Well, what happened with the first round of firings of the quote unquote probationary employees, which I think that means they were just staff who were newer to working at Great Smoky Mountains National Park? Because you know some of the people that were fired recently, right?
I do. And even though many of these people were new to permanent jobs or had just been promoted to a new position, many of them, like me, had worked for years, many seasons before they got that prize, the permanent job. And
Right.
they're well qualified people and very skilled in specialties. So some of the folks I know were trail crew, so people that hike 5 miles first thing in the morning to cut trees out of trails and build new trails, museum curation, plant ecology, um, some some dedicated professionals were just strictly cut loose on very short notice on a false premise, you'd have to say. I saw the email that they received that said they were being hired because their performance was not up to standard and their skills were not what was needed, which is just not true. It's really insulting and demoralizing and shocking to the rest of us. So these folks come in to work on Monday and they're ready to get their tools set and go to work. And instead of that, they're ushered into a room for a Zoom conference with the park management, explaining very little and asked to sign forms that acknowledge that yes, I was fired because I had poor performance,
Ugh,
and there was no
not
severance paid.
fair.
It was terrible, and and people's lives were disrupted. So we have that personal cost as well as the cost to the park and its resources that we regret.
Right. Like I remember you telling me that you were able to maybe give a little work to some of the women who worked on the trail crew by giving them a project in your own, yard, but that's like a temporary fix. They're going to need, that's their livelihood. And now
Yeah,
no severance and no notice, they're
yeah,
let go and they don't have any, financial safety net there.
it's true. And people have bills to pay. There are
Yeah.
very few park employees that have a trust fund or any kind of real backup. So these are folks with car payments, student loans, uh, kids,
Yeah.
uh, that all of those sorts of things. And it's sad too because like the trail crew women, they're a really dedicated, tight knit crew,
Yeah.
hardworking folks that hike a long ways. And I had them rebuilding some raised beds in my yard, and man, it was like having Paul Bunyan's there. They picked this up, they haul that there, and they, laughed and talked, and you could see they were just used to working as a team. And
Yeah.
they're hoping that they'll be hired as seasonals. The
Mm.
parks have been given permission to hire seasonals, but the hiring process, when I was hiring seasonals for the summer, it started in December. You get the announcements out, you do interviews, you check references,
Hey.
people get background checks. It's not like you can just go find somebody standing around in front of Home Depot and say, hey, come on.
Right.
And so they're hoping to get hired back, but they're not sure. They said that they had heard from their supervisor. They're in close contact, but he said, and we were supposed to have had this first aid class that we have to have in order to operate chainsaws, and we can't pay for it because we can't buy anything. We can't pay the Red Cross $5 a piece to get first aid training. So it's been very confusing and stressful to the people who have already been laid off.
Yeah. And also, it's like now we've got basically Trump and Elon Musk are like millionaires, billionaires, and they're cutting off working class, middle class Americans' livelihoods and bragging about like what minimal savings there are while not thinking about the ultimate costs too. So I also just find that, and I think a lot of people find that uh, outrageous, just that people with so much wealth can so callously cut off people who are doing a good job working for the government with no, yeah, thought and notice or gratitude or plan. It's as if, like, it just seems punitive. Um,
Mm, It
yeah,
it is, and of course the people who are pulling the levers up there have really no idea what park employees
right.
do. I think there's the thought that they stand around in those cute little hats and tell people where the bathrooms are, but we've got people with advanced degrees and years of experience and people that know the park and are used to working together as a team. So I would hire a new seasonal who moves here from Iowa, they the first 3 months is okay. Here's where this trail is, and this
Yeah,
is what this tree is, and I think I'd be starting the same place with some of these people who are pulling the levers, and this is a snake, and and you can't drink this. All
yeah,
those, I think they fundamentally don't understand what we do, and so it's easy for them to think that we're all just sitting in front of computers wasting their money, because they just don't know. And of course, if they cared, they would find out. But we
yeah.
see
'Cause
them.
We, I know there's like they were expecting more firings, what they call a reduction in force, that it might be coming
Mm-hmm.
up this month, and next month. Um, Kristine, can I read a little bit of that letter from Russell Vought that was sent to the heads of all the agencies related to that? Because it kind of gets at what you're talking about, like the insulting way they're describing the government workers. So this is a memo that went out on February 26th to the heads of executive departments and agencies from Russell Vought, Director, Office of Management and Budget. And he was newly appointed just by the Senate recently, and he is one of the key contributors to Project 2025, that conservative policy agenda that Trump during the election claimed he knew nothing about, but we knew that he wasn't telling the truth and that he was going to put in place people to enact that. But anyway, so this is about guidance on the reduction in force based on Trump's workforce optimization initiative, it's called. But just listen to the language that's used. It says the federal government is costly, inefficient, and deeply in debt. At the same time, it's not producing results for the American public. Instead, tax dollars are being siphoned off to fund unproductive and unnecessary programs that benefit radical interest groups while hurting hardworking American citizens. Like what? I'm thinking this is okay. Then it says the American people registered their verdict on the bloated, corrupt federal bureaucracy on November 5th by voting for President Trump and his promises to sweepingly reform the federal government. On February 11th, President Trump's executive order implementing the President's Department of Government Efficiency Workforce Optimization Initiative commenced a critical transformation of the federal bureaucracy. It directed agencies to eliminate waste, bloat, and insularity in order to empower American families, workers, taxpayers, and our system of government itself. Um, I don't know, Kristine, what are your thoughts on the language using terms like bloat and inefficient, unnecessary,
Mm-hmm.
unproductive? And the only person that's hardworking is the Americans, but not anybody who works for the government, apparently, according to this.
Whoever they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does seem to come from someone who's very disengaged and uninformed about what the federal government actually does. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
I just think the language is just so rude and unnecessary. It's one thing if you're trying to save money, even though I don't think this is the right way to do it, and there's plenty of other ways to save money. But yeah, you don't need to insult people and act like everybody
mm-hmm.
is wasting taxpayer money. And also, I don't think that's what the voters actually voted for if they were voting for Trump. I mean, some of them, I guess, did, but a
Hmm.
lot of people were just worried about the economy or something, and they were rolling the dice there. But so I think just this mandate. That's why I do think I'm hoping that if we get more upset about things, we'll show that there isn't a mandate for this because um like I'm worried. I don't know if do you know how many more people are like expected in this reduction in force? Because I know you know so many of the people that work there, you hired them, like you must be worried for them.
I am, and part of the stress is that park management is either not able or is unwilling to share with the staff what plan they're following to determine who will be fired next.
Mm.
So we have seen reductions in force over my 40 years with the government, the RIF, and the process is you look at any positions that are already vacant. You could look at things that, maybe we don't need a clerical worker who types everything up for you anymore because we can do our own word processing. There's ways of
Yeah, that's efficiency. Yeah.
that's efficiency. That is right. But what we have here is uh, the remaining staff being very stressed. And you can picture people waking up every morning going, "Oh no, and what will happen now, and who will be next, and what will happen to my family, and will I have to move, and can we even take the kids to the movies tonight because we might not have any, and can we afford those things?" And it it has a ripple effect through the community because kids are worried. They go to school and their teachers hear them talking. Well, we don't know, mom, dad, they might lose their job. We might have to move. Kids are worried. The people that have craft shops, the artisans, the people that work in tourism, they're worried.
Mm.
It's their bottom line as well as caring about their friends and neighbors. So
Plus, it's
it's,
expensive to live around a park too, because a lot of times people build like
mm-hmm,
vacation homes and they drive up
mm-hmm,
the cost of housing like around Gatlinburg. And so if someone lost their park job, unless they could find another job in tourism or something, they might not be able to even stay there. And then they have to pull their kids out of school and move, like you're saying.
mm-hmm. And some people have deep roots here. I know
Yeah, they don't want to leave.
some of my folks there, I mean, their grandparents lived in the park and then moved out. There's family traditions for some folks. And then there are people who moved here at great expense because it was, I mean, geez, for me to be a forester working in a tree park, it was the job I wanted. I would have moved from a long ways if I didn't already live here.
Yeah.
And it is expensive. Some people, actually, a lot of people live far out in Knoxville or Maryville and drive an hour commute to get here. And so some of those people I know were ones that looked at the taking the fork in the road buyout because they already have a long commute. They don't know what's going to happen with their job, and they they just thought maybe that might be the better way to go.
And just for
But
our
this,
listeners, that fork in the road buyout was when
mm,
I guess it was Elon Musk sent that initial letter weeks ago that was just like, hey, everybody, don't you want to quit? And like, we can give you, because otherwise you might get fired, who knows? And then we'll give you severance or something, or through like September or October or something. But then nobody know whether that was true or not. So, but it was referred to as the fork in the road. And so some people
mm-hmm,
took it even though they didn't know, and then some people got fired anyway, and they're not sure if
mm-hmm.
they're going to get the severance. So confusing and
it
botched, really.
It it is. It may be the way that people operate in the corporate world these days, and they think that employees are to be abused, and that people move without a care from one job to another because if you can do a widget here, you can do a widget there. But people don't work for the Park Service for that reason. The jobs don't pay that much. It, People are here because they really love what they do.
Right. And when you were talking about how kind of scared everybody is, even the kids. It also makes it laughable that Doge, Elon Musk organization is sending out those emails to government employees asking them to document like 5 achievements from the past week, or and then they'll run it through some AI thing to see whether you have a useful job or not. But it's also, what's funny to me about that is like if somebody asked me what have I done in the last week after this, you traumatized my whole organization, started firing people. Well, I'm not getting a heck of a lot done is what's happening. Let's see, I'm looking online to find another job. I'm finding a quiet place in the forest to
Mhm.
sob and cry. I'm like gossiping with my coworkers about, the doom and gloom of the situation. Like it's like, who has been productive? They're also just, this whole shakeup is causing inefficiency, because it's
Mhm.
so bad for morale. It's so mishandled.
It is, and I know the one of the science team that was fired was packing up his desk and taking down the pictures of his family
Hmm.
and going over his work plan, what he had planned to do the rest of the year with who was left of his work team. Okay, can you do this? Can you do this? And what are we not going to do? Which is a lot. And then there's no ability to purchase anything. So if
Yeah,
you're on
what's
the trail,
going on with that in terms of a freeze on spending or something? Is that because of budget cuts, or is it a freeze on spending?
well, we don't have a budget.
Yeah.
We're operating under a continuing resolution until next week when they may or may not agree on a budget. But the other directive that came down last week was that all government purchase cards were reduced to $1. And so there were two people left in the entire southeast region of the National Park Service, and this was across all of the Department of Interior that could purchase anything. And that's where you come down to, when I had a purchase card, I would go to the hardware store and we need a box, we need this or that, we need this tool, we need a new chainsaw. We'd
Yeah.
go to the local businesses and buy stuff. We'd go to the auto parts store. When you'd go to the local garage, we need an oil change. We have a flat tire. You can't do any of that. So it does hamstring the operations to the point where, yes, people are going to notice that there's trees down on the trails because the trail crew's either been fired, or they're unable to get their safety training so they can use their chainsaws legally. People might notice some things like that. When I went to Twin Creeks the other day, we just had a big windstorm and a whole bunch of tiles were missing from the roof,
Hmm.
and there were buckets in the lab catching rain coming in. And normally we would have right away called a local roofing contract company and done a contract, get the roof fixed, before more damage is done. Can't do that. So there's that repercussion throughout the community about the park's inability to purchase, and then it will hobble the park as days go on without any ability to buy anything, and bills aren't paid. Can't
Right.
pay the electric bill. um,
Ridiculous.
yeah.
If you're just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature. I'm host Carrie Freeman, talking about how to save and support our National Park Service from Musk and Trump's attacks on funding and staff. I'm speaking with Kristine Johnson, who recently retired from over 30 years with the National Park Service at Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee and North Carolina, where she served as supervisory forester, and she now works as a volunteer, which demonstrates that people who work at our parks really love our parks. And one of the nonprofit organizations Kristine likes is called Peer Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. That's peer.org. And we'll probably mention that again uh, later. Oh, Christina, I also wanted to mention that there's also like a hiring freeze, right? Like they're not hiring anyone now. And so that's going to mean a lot of vacant positions. And it also, that makes it hard to recruit anyone to the federal government. And I'm also thinking long term, it's like a brain drain because I mean, who's going to want to work under these conditions? And and I'd asked you about another park employee that I had interviewed for my book, the supervisor of the wildlife biology area, Bill Stiver, and you're saying that he recently retired, but they were going to hire a replacement for him as the wildlife biologist, but then that person like couldn't start, they weren't allowed to start them. So now that nobody's in charge of wildlife biology at this humongous national park.
That's correct. They had made a careful decision about positions that we can fill or we can't fill based on the continuing resolution, but everyone had agreed we really have to have a supervisory wildlife person.
Yeah.
And so a job was offered, and then it had to be rescinded because as soon as the current administration took over, they initiated a hiring freeze. So no hiring. We also had vacancies. The deputy superintendent position was empty, and they were working on filling that. And then the superintendent retired in December, perhaps having seen what was ahead.
Yeah.
And so now the park is led by an acting deputy superintendent. And we just a few weeks ago were given an acting superintendent who's someone who's on a detail from another park.
Yeah.
So these are the people who are trying to please the upper management of Department of Interior to the extent that they can. But the park had also decided that they needed to fill one of the vacant wildlife technician positions. They did manage to hire that person before it was in December they'd begun work, but they were fired as a probationary employee.
Oh,
So now they're down two really important wildlife positions, just as the people are beginning to come here for spring break, and lots of folks out in the back country. Bears are coming out of their more dormant period. There's lots of going to be bears with cubs. There's going to be skunks, raccoons. Lots of wildlife will be out, and without park staff to educate them, people are going to interact inappropriately and dangerously. And of course, the wildlife biologists, their first mission is to protect the wildlife from people doing stupid things. But if an elk gets hit by a car and injured, the they call the wildlife. You can call 911. You got to call somebody. You call the wildlife biologist, and they will see about veterinary care and do what they can with it. If people misbehave in the backcountry, if the park's not able to get people to follow the rules of backcountry camping, then there's going to be garbage in the backcountry. People are going to fish, clean the fish, and leave trash all over the place. Bears will come to the backcountry campsites. More people will be interacting with bears. People can carry firearms in the park now, so if they feel threatened, maybe they might just shoot the wildlife that they see, or maybe they'll just shoot it for fun.
yeah.
Without the park rangers and the wildlife staff and the backcountry team, the regulations the park has, for very good reasons, will not be enforced.
Yeah, thank you for sharing about some of these likely effects and also for bringing in the non-human animals who live in the park that they're affected by the humans that
Mm-hmm.
are there to protect them, and who do all kinds of research about what's best for them and what's best for their habitats, like you did. Because I was wondering, yeah, what are some of the likely effects of all these mass firings and funding reductions, since the park is already understaffed and underfunded in terms of like there's going to be fewer services and programs, but then there's still going to be millions of people flocking to the park, and so but there's going to be less people working to not only to service the visitors, but to, yeah, protect the wildlife or maintain the habitats and everything.
Mm-hmm. So, like in the example of the backcountry campsite that I gave, if under our previous levels of staffing, a camper said, "Oh, we saw a bear and it didn't run away when we tried to scare it," they'd report that to the backcountry team, and the backcountry team would report it to wildlife, they'd close that backcountry
Mhm.
campsite. Wildlife would put up a fake tent with a camera, and they just let that campsite be unused until such time as no bears showed up in their camera, and then they'd reopen it. But without that level of communication and expertise, that won't happen. Bill, before he retired, he and his team were working on a really wonderful and useful means of tracking bears with GPS collars, so you could see their range is huge. A bear could be in Gatlinburg one night and be up at LeConte Lodge the next night. So we never knew that.
Yeah.
But we learned that through the work of dedicated professionals working with university scientists. And so, yes, people will notice the difference. I fear that one goal of this current regime is to privatize the parks,
Oh.
because knowing so little about what park staff actually do, they say, well, pick up the garbage. We'll just hire some people to pick up the garbage, and run the bookstore. We'll just hire people to sell books. And that they may be able to fill some positions. They would the first to be considered privatized as facilities, but that person in the uniform who's picking up cigarette butts outside the restroom, that's the person that when your kid falls and scrapes their knee, they're going to go to that person in uniform and say, help. If your spouse has a heart attack, go to that person in uniform, and they'll get on the park radio, because cell reception isn't everywhere, and they'll get on the park radio. They'll call for the emergency rangers to come. They'll say, hey, I know there's an AED over here in this building. Let's go get that. They're trained in first aid. I mean, their facility staff is the front line of visitor contact, and they'll be the first ones to go with privatization. And the rest of it's just going to go, because they won't be trying to privatize natural resource management or any of that stuff that they don't know enough to
And that's what
appreciate.
you did was the natural, like by like rewilding areas and making sure
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't, invasive species, and so that
Yeah.
the habitat would be healthy. Because yeah, if some people just look at this like as the parks as like a big concession, like a big just recreational tourist facility, even though that goes against the missions of the park, which says you need public access, but you need to protect the wilderness, but also Trump is a real estate developer. So, I mean, I think,
Mm-hmm.
he would look at a park as like a place that should have a golf course or like more hotels, more access, more
Mm-hmm.
roads. But every road, every building is disruptive to the native inhabitants there. And so it's always hard to balance the needs of the human public tourists and the protection of the natural resources. And so I think if you put more concessions in there and tourist pressures, that's going to overwhelm the wildlife part.
It will. There'll be a failure to preserve and protect the resources. People will be digging plants and cutting trees and digging ginseng to sell. I mean, we already, the law enforcement folks, spend a lot of time on poaching and just protecting the resources. There's a development. There's a big chunk of land became available recently outside of Pigeon Forge, right on the park boundary, and the developer made it into all-terrain vehicle rampaging territory, and
That's
they're
loud.
they're advertising that it's just like the park without the rules. Like, rules are bad. And so that land is going to be trashed. It's going to be eroded. There's going to be landslides, flash floods, muddy streams. Wildlife will be terrorized and leave
Yeah,
unless
they
they're
won't be able
shot.
to
So,
migrate through there or, yeah, make
right.
areas.
So
And the noise
that,
pollution.
and the noise, the interference with their lives. I mean, even scent of a person ruins the day of a box turtle.
Yeah. Sometimes it ruins my
um,
day, but yes.
yeah. And so I think that would be the vision of privatizing the park. We'll do away with the rules. We'll let people, have fun, tear things up. That's some people's idea of a good time. And yeah, bears, shoot, let's have some big game hunting here. That's what we fear, and that's something the people in the community fear too, that this is a treasured place for them, and they live downstream, and the park protects a huge 800,000 acres of watershed. So the fact that it's a forested watershed, these steep mountains, yes, we have flash floods, but if you look at the floods that occurred here right after the park was logged, or what before the park was established and the watersheds were denuded, terrible flash floods. Yeah, Sevierville underwater. People died, dozens of people would die regularly in flash floods. So that's what happens when you don't protect the watershed too.
Right. So also properly, the research staff like you are that work in natural resources protection help to there's these what they might call ecosystem services that like you're
Mm-hmm.
describing that you need people to understand it's not just a bunch of trees that look pretty or something that all of
Mm-hmm.
this protects the water quality and erosion and like that there's so many things that we take for granted until it's gone until they've logged and other things or the wildlife is gone and then you see the negative effects. So that's why just this idea that Doge and Elon Musk are kind of coming in with a literal kind of the chainsaw metaphor and just like cutting people off, not knowing what the true costs are. Like, because most people, it's an investment when we hire someone for their salary. It's an investment in what they bring in the to the whole community long term. It's not just like yeah, like, oh, we can save, $40,000 on someone's salary or something. It's a whole investment in the area,
That's
in
true.
the
And
community, and the costs are going to be so high.
that's true. And the trail crew folks, they're very skilled with rock work and working with grade, like civil engineers. But and the park's managed as wilderness. It's a de facto wilderness, and so a new regime might come in and say, "Well, we'll just bulldoze those trails and make them nice for the UTVs." But there'll be huge amounts of erosion because those trails were never made to be roads. They were, based on old goat paths or railroad grades. They're not something that you can maintain like a road, and so you can't make it into a road and expect that it's going to be even remotely sustainable.
Right. So people who are naive to these things can do a lot of long-term damage by kind of putting roads through or just trying to
Mm-hmm.
what they think makes something prettier for the tourists or easier access.
Mm-hmm.
But then
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
it's causing all kinds of erosion and damage, and then wildlife can't get where they need to go.
Mm-hmm. Streams choked with mud, there won't be fish, and so maybe you come to the park because you want to go trout fishing. Well, you won't be able to do that. It was a long, long process, decades following the logging era before there were fishable streams here again.
Interesting. So everything's just so interconnected. Yeah. Well, Kristine, for any of us listening who are wondering what we can do to help support the National Park Service and maybe we could try to get the employees rehired, what are some of your suggestions for what people could do or organizations that we could support?
Well, it's a struggle these days. Even people like me that are keen to know, it's a struggle to keep up with the news. But people
Yeah.
need to follow it with good, reliable news outlets, know what's going on. I have seen. I was looking at the Knoxville News Sentinel. National Parks Conservation Association has a few people speaking out. I saw a lot of quotes from Bill Wade, who's long retired, and he worked here in the Smokies. But that's the kind of source they're having to go to get some kind of recon about what's going on in the park, because the
Because
park
the
administration,
employees can't talk about, which is why I'm talking to you because you're retired. Because
that's
otherwise
right.
you wouldn't be able to talk to me.
And there will be no press releases. The park administration management, they are forbidden to say how many people are, any of that information. So it's a little hard to come by, but National Parks Conservation Association and PEER have been good organizations to
Tell us
follow
again
to
about
kind
Peer, because you introduced me to them, and I don't know why I didn't know about them. But they've got, when I went to the peer.org website, they also had some good like petitions and like how to
of.
contact your Congress people kind of
They
mechanism.
they are they that organization has been around for a long time, and it has been a great service to whistleblowers. They actually file lawsuits, and they're very outspoken about this sort of outrage, because that's the purpose of that organization. So they
Peer stands for the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility.
That's right. And so it covers Park Service, Forest Service, really any public employees, municipal and state. So they've got a pretty good beat on it, but their organizational structure is largely people who have worked in these organizations and have a science background, natural resource background, as well as a legal background,
Yeah.
and can speak out without, you know, relatively without fear. And it's hard to know anymore, how, but they're supported by donations by people like me. I've been a member for a long time.
I recently donated to Peer once you mentioned them. And then there's, yeah, we talked about the National Park Conservation Association. There's a coalition to protect America's national parks.
Hmm.
I think that's a different thing from the National Park Conservation Association, right?
That's correct. That organization is primarily retired Park Service folks, in my knowledge of it, and I'm a member of that as well. But
The
they
coalition to protect America's national parks.
yes, and so many of their members and board members are former park superintendents. So people that really know how parks are managed and what we can do to help them, and they can be articulate because they have spoken to Congress before. But
Yeah.
at the same time, no one wants to do anything that will imperil park employees, and everyone's very afraid, of speaking out. You
Culture of
feel
fear.
like you need to keep your head down and look for the next blow, but it's important for those of us who can speak out to do so, and for the public certainly to be informed and contact their representatives and get out there and say what you think about it.
Yeah, and so like since this is a federal level situation, we should be like I contacted my federal level Congress people. So you've got your representative in the House and then
Mm-hmm.
your two senators. And so for us in Georgia, that's Senators Ossoff and Warnock. And so I have their numbers in my phone. And so
Mm-hmm.
it really just it's either you leave a message or a member of their staff just takes your message. Like it's very easy to
Mm-hmm.
talk to them and you can keep it kind of short and just telling them, what you're thinking. But I guess the hope is that more of us that call and say, we don't want all these federal employees fired. This is awful. This is going to be,
Mm-hmm.
sign up for this or something like that. I mean, that's basically what I'm saying. What are you going to do? The more pressure. Now, all my representatives are Democrats, so I know they're probably on board with what I'm saying, but I don't know what they can actually do. I mean, I suppose if someone's representative, their senators' representatives were members of the Republican Party, that gives them more power to do something, but then that may make it more likely they won't do anything because they kind of toe the party line a lot. But I don't know. I mean, maybe they will if they get enough constituent pressure.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I think, even though Sevier County, for instance, was solidly Republican, and our representative they probably feel like they have a great mandate, but I think it is still good to say Sevier County may have voted for you, but we didn't vote for this. And if you think we're going to vote for you again, if you don't do something, then that sort of thing. So yes,
Right.
they have the power, and if they hear from people that are deeply upset, I mean, say a lot of people that are getting laid off are veterans, people who've served their country in the military, made a lot of sacrifices. They don't know who these people are.
Right. They
They
literally
need to see a
don't know.
face. They
Don't
need to see some faces and some stories.
Yeah. And you also mentioned indivisible.org,
Mm-hmm.
indivisible.org, and that's kind of like a grassroots group that's kind of generally fighting for democracy. And so I just went on there and then I found a local indivisible group here in Atlanta. And then I just signed up to
Mm-hmm.
go to one of their virtual events where we get to meet with Senator Warnock next week. And so I'm like, that's
Mm-hmm.
great. Okay, now we can all maybe brainstorm together what we can do to
Hmm. There's
better.
a Indivisible in Knoxville, and I first knew of them because of the um, pride marches and pride awareness. But they've stepped right up to what needs to be done, and they have a good network of getting people out to be active. So
Yeah.
if you want to know what the local protests are and where they are, Indivisible is a good place to check.
Well, that's the end of our show, but I want to thank you so much, Kristine Johnson, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. And thanks for your decades of ongoing service to the National Park Service and for helping us understand how and why we can support our park employees during Trump's attack on our government agencies.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to In Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. It used to air from 6:30 to 7 Eastern Time, but it's going to start to be a show that's an hour long from 6 o'clock to 7. We also have a podcast and other action items that you can find on the website facebook.com/intune to nature. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board, staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non commercial media like Radio Free Georgia. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including our federal government employees who need our help. Thank you for listening. Cheers.